Talks again in Islamabad was always fiction. There was no evidence for any Iranian interest in doing so. The last talks were disappointing. The Iranians showed up with 70 people, large quantities of data, information, maps, and so forth, in the expectation that there was an intention to negotiate and come up with some sort of mutually agreeable solution. There wasn't. And, when you have someone like Vice President Vance getting up during the meeting to go outside and take a call from Mr. Netanyahu, it suggests that these are not really negotiations. It also suggests that Mr. Netanyahu, not Mr. Trump, is in charge. And I think effectively, for the purposes of deciding whether we will or will not fight, that's probably accurate. So I think President Trump was trying to calm the markets again. He's done this several times, said things that were patently false about the likelihood of the war ending sooner rather than later, and that the Iranians were desperate for talks when they weren't, conveying the illusion, I suppose, that we were somehow or another winning this conflict in the Persian Gulf. We aren't. And as a result, I think there will be no talks. The ceasefire expires at 3 a.m., tomorrow in Iran. That's Iranian time. And I think the Iranians are preparing to be attacked again, and they're also preparing for the possibility that we will attack even sooner. So at this point, I think we should just dismiss whatever comes out of the White House as effectively nonsense, largely designed to calm the public and manipulate the markets. But I think that's over now. Sort of provide you with a strategic overview from the vantage point of people on the outside looking in. And I'm talking about people, I'm talking about the rest of the world that is watching what we are doing and what Iran is doing. Increasingly, we're seen as this aspiring supranational authority that wants to impose its will on everyone, everywhere. Iran has opted to stand up against this, and the world is very anxious to see what the outcome will be. We have always had the ability, certainly since, I would argue, 1899, to project power. In fact, that was the whole purpose of President Teddy Roosevelt's Great White Fleet. And he was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy when the Spanish-American War began, and that was the first time that we attempted to fight beyond the Western Hemisphere. We sent a fleet to Manila Bay in the Philippines, and we managed to defeat the Spanish fleet, which was rather antiquated, and we discovered we had no ground force that we could put ashore to claim victory. And so then we sat in the bay and waited for some period of time until some troops arrived, and the rest is history. But since then, we have been able to do that. We are not inherently defensive. We are a power that banks on the offense, the ability to attack beyond its normal limits in order to impose our power. Now, the Iranians are an inherently defensive power. They spend perhaps 1, maybe 2% of what we do on defense, and their investment has been in fundamentally defensive weapons. Contrary to the sort of unending Israeli propaganda and the propaganda by their agents that control our mainstream media, the Iranians can't really reach very far beyond their own borders. So they are in a strategic defense posture. And if you look at the two, one is operating 7,000 miles away from its logistical support base, its manufacturing support, and the other is operating essentially from within the boundaries of its own country. And as a result, there is a home court advantage, as we say in basketball. And the Iranians have invested very heavily in a new form of warfare that has reduced us to a position very similar to what was happening on the Western Front in 1914 and 1915. That if you try to move against Iran, you are identified, you are targeted, you are attacked from anywhere from 500 to 1,000 miles beyond Iran's borders. That makes it very difficult when you're dependent upon air and naval power to attack your opponent. That means you have to move your support and sustainment thousands of miles. You have to periodically refuel, reload from a great distance. The Iranians don't have to deal with that. And most of their critical facilities and stores are underground. Now, that's the picture. So what can we expect to happen now? I think that we have replenished our stocks in the theater. We have sort of resupplied all of our platforms, naval and air, with required munitions. Now, how long will they last? I would say you would see something again similar to what we did the last time. I think there will be greater emphasis on an initial period of intensity. In other words, the first 48 to 96 hours will be more intense than what we saw previously. In other words, more sorties, more missiles, more bombings. And these will be concentrated on what are allegedly critical targets that, if sufficiently damaged, could influence the outcome of the operation. Remember, this is an air and missile operation. That means that everything depends upon the targets you select. You're looking for targets and portions of a targeting system that will give you a strategic advantage over your enemy, that will convince your enemy to give up, to say, enough's enough, I can't go any further. And we've been trying this really since the end of the First World War. There were massive bombing attacks, long-distance strikes, interdiction, as well as close air support in the last 6 months of the war. We tried many of these things, and then when World War II came, we doubled down on all of this. We saw a lot of people experiment with different ways to approach this during the Spanish Civil War. But my point is that certainly since 1945, the air power community in the United States has been trying to prove that the air power community can do everything. So it was always foolish to expect that anyone who is a member of that community, like General Kane, the Air Force four-star, would step forward and say, I don't think you should do this, Mr. President. If you try to do it, it probably won't work. It would be a strategic disaster. No, I think what he probably said is there are pros and cons. There are things we can do and maybe things we can't, but we can certainly do the following, laid out what was essentially a plan for an air and missile campaign. So now what I think you're going to see is a far more intense opening salvo. That salvo will be designed to be, in President Trump's words, a war-winning operation. It's going to be so furious and so devastating that the Iranian forces and their citizenry won't recover. That means the objective now is to destroy the Iranian state. That needs to be understood. When you begin attacking bridges and road networks and railways, power plants, desalination plants, oil infrastructure, that's about destruction of the state. You have moved beyond what you considered to be critical military targets and are focused largely on critical infrastructure. I think that's what you're going to see now. And we did that during the Second War. Its effects were mixed. The most important thing we did during World War II, in retrospect, were two things. Number one, we destroyed the fuel distribution and manufacturing system. So you couldn't produce fuel, you couldn't redistribute it. That opened the path for the Soviet armies in the East. And then the second part was that you couldn't refuel your Air Force. And that also meant that all of your air forces were concentrated on the protection of your cities. Now, the Iranians don't have an air force. The president talks about destroying the air force. They really haven't had an air force of significance since the Shah left. So they have very few aircraft. That was never a major player, just like the Navy was never a major player. The Navy consists largely of fast speedboats, unmanned submersibles, unmanned service craft designed to operate in the Persian Gulf. Not much further. So everything relies on missiles, target acquisition. Match the missiles, match the unmanned systems to the various missiles or various targets. We think the Iranians have perhaps 45 to 50,000 unmanned systems remaining, maybe more. They certainly have somewhere between 15 to 20,000, maybe some more missiles. I would say that that is more than an adequate supply to sustain Iran through several weeks. And they still have the ability beneath ground, out of reach, to manufacture missiles and manufacture drones. How many, how rapidly, I don't know. But we also know that the Chinese resupplied them, the Russians resupplied them. When you turn to our side, Do we have another 1,000 joint air surface-to-surface missiles? We expended 1,000 of those in the first 3 weeks, most of those, frankly, in the space of a week. I don't know. I suspect we've probably replenished those stocks. There are others where we've replenished with as much as we can provide, particularly your anti-missile missiles, your PAC-3, your THAAD missiles. What have we got in terms of radars? Well, that's a grim picture. The radars that are being destroyed have not been replaced. They cost hundreds of millions of dollars, take years to manufacture. Whether or not we have anything left to put on the ground, I don't know. It could be that we would bring in whatever is left around the world. But my point is, I think the Iranians are in a better position than we are. That doesn't mean that they'll win and we'll lose. It's too soon to say that. Then the other point is, how many precision-guided bombs do we have? And do we have unguided bombs? I suppose we probably do. And if you're trying to demoralize your enemy, we still periodically rely on the provision of, say, B-52s, each of which carries 90 500-pound bombs. You do the math. How many B-52s can you fly over an area? That's called carpet bombing. That clearly can be done. Then the Israelis have been reprovisioned as much as we could afford, but I don't think their air and missile defense is likely to be infinitely more capable than it was. I think they're in a tougher position. We still have a lot of missile defense in the fleet. So that's the picture. We have a lot more ships now at sea. We have more carriers out there, more pilots, more planes. I think we have replaced the losses of the KC-135s, the fuel tankers. So I think we're gearing up for something similar to what you saw before, only far more intense up front. Now, you asked about ground troops. What I find interesting, based on the reports that you read, and I'm not on the inside. I'm not attending any of these meetings, so what I'm dealing with is hearsay, Glenn. That means I'm reading what the New York Times, the Washington Post, and others who are fed things by the Central Intelligence Agency and the National Security Agency and so forth, and from the Pentagon. And what they're suggesting is that President Trump has been unenthusiastic about the use of ground forces. He has said, I don't really want to do that. That's a very good thing, because I can't imagine any operation involving the use of ground forces in the Persian Gulf to seize islands that would make any difference to the outcome in the Gulf. I just can't imagine it. I don't know what they would be used for, because it's not going to give them control of the Gulf just because they're sitting on an island. And I always worry about, how do you resupply them? How do you evacuate people that are wounded? All this sort of business. Now, we'll see whether or not they try to do something. I'm sure Special Operations Command wants to do things. I'd be very surprised if people in the Army and the Marines don't want to do something. But I'm encouraged that President Trump, at least, has expressed reservations about it. So what will the Iranians do? And I think this is very important. We talked about the enormous damage we're prepared to do. They made it very clear that they will destroy most of what's on the west coast of the Persian Gulf. And that is of great concern to the entire world. If you stop and consider that the ingredients for your fertilizer, about 50% of these things, urea, nitrogen, phosphate, and so forth, 50% of it comes out of the Persian Gulf. And you're going to destroy this infrastructure? I think we're looking down the line at famine across the global south. It's unavoidable. We talk in terms of liquid natural gas and petroleum. Those are already problems. There are people rationing things already in India, in Indonesia, in Thailand, and Vietnam. The cost of a barrel of jet fuel, I'm told, is now over $240 a barrel and rising. It's not even on hand. Apparently, Britain is going to run out of anything in about 2 weeks in terms of both jet fuel and heating fuel. And of course, all these countries in Western Europe that have gone crazy on the green energy business are in terrible positions. And they've also shut down many of their nuclear reactors. Now, the French haven't, but the Germans have. And I'm sure this is an emergency status. I think what you're going to see happen in Europe now, governments are going to be overthrown. You're going to see new governments come to power. What can they do? Well, we'll see. I don't think they're going to be able to correct the problems very quickly because most analysts that have looked at what I would say, the magnitude of destruction from the first round have said it'll take a year, maybe 2 years, if we were to stop now to recover in the Persian Gulf. And most people, understanding what I've just outlined to you, are concluding accurately, I think, that it will take 5 to 10 years to recover. And we're not sure what recover means because a lot of this infrastructure in the Gulf may never be rebuilt. I mean, the decision may simply be made not to go back in there. And if anybody does go in there, I would say it would probably be China. Because right now, the sort of global, what's the right word? The sort of global safe area for cash and money is increasingly going to be China, not the United States. And I think that's where things are headed. If you look at just the credit markets, people are going to go to China to borrow, not come to the United States. And I think the petrodollar is already dead. Whether or not the yuan replaces it is anybody's guess. Probably could, but it may be a basket of currencies. And I think the Emirates and the Saudi House of Saud, all of these people are really in danger of losing their countries in the sense that others will take over in their absence. Because we know that large numbers of the Gulf elites have already fled to Egypt and Europe and other places. And again, we don't know what will happen in the region this time around. You have the Turks that have geared up, in my estimation, to be far more involved this time around than they were previously. So are the Egyptians. I don't see how Israel fares very well through all of this because whatever incentive may have existed in the past for the Iranians to exercise restraint no longer exists. And I think they've made that very clear. They're ready to go to a total war fitting. We've never done that. And the lesson of history is he who goes to total war fitting, certainly in the 20th century, has a better shot of winning if he does it immediately than the person who does it. Remember, we forget that Hitler did not totally mobilize the German state and nation and people for war until mid-1943. How could you possibly wage war on multiple fronts the way they did and expect to win? On the other hand, the Soviets lived in a state of war mobilization and went to total mobilization very quickly. We did too, and so did Great Britain. We are not going to do that to defeat Iran. That's an impossibility. Now, I should be careful because I'm sure you've seen the report that apparently General Kane, in his infinite wisdom, suggested to President Trump that it might be useful to consider conducting operations in the Strait of Malacca against Iranian vessels. I think that's a catastrophe. But it's not unusual for someone who's already losing a war to think that they could expand the war to other areas and conceal the loss in one place and ultimately bring it to a successful close elsewhere. I'm not sure that's a good idea, but I know that there are people that probably think that way. And there are foolish people out there who say, well, fine, then we'll also stop Chinese ships because, after all, the Chinese are supporting the Iranians. That's your opportunity to spread and widen the war even further. And one of the reasons the Chinese have been so sensitive to the South China Sea is they know from their history that whoever controls the South China Sea ultimately controls the flow of resources into and out of China. The Royal Navy did that. The French did it before the Royal Navy. And ultimately, the Imperial Japanese Navy did it. So the bottom line is I see no good news here, no good new direction. The ideal outcome, frankly, at this stage would be to simply end this series of hostilities and put a stop to the whole thing and admit that we cannot, employing our military power, gain control of the Strait of Hormuz. What the Iranians have got, they're going to keep. And it's up to the rest of the world, once this war ends, to sit down with Iran and work out something similar to the Montreux Convention, which was created in 1926 and put the Turks in charge of the Dardanelles. By the way, the Turks have handled that very well. There haven't been any problems there. A similar convention can be set up, and I think the Iranians are the logical choice, given their strategic position, to run it. We don't like that. We're opposed to that, but we keep forgetting we don't live there, Glenn. We don't live in Asia. We don't live in Europe. We don't live in Africa. We live in the Western Hemisphere. It's a huge problem. It's a strategic reality that we really don't want to accept. And we don't want to accept the fact that warfare has now changed dramatically. And with the right mix of missiles and unmanned systems and space-based surveillance and good communications, command and control, a much lesser power with fewer resources can be much more effective against a maritime aerospace power that doesn't have those advantages.
It seems that bringing the fight to the Strait of Malacca would be a